Hey friends, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. What time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from? If you can, dim the lights, set a fan to a gentle hum, and settle down under a blanket. Let your shoulders drop, let the day soften. Tonight you wake up in the slow heat of a wooden world. The room is cramped, not much wider than your outstretched arms. Timber ribs creak like a living animal, tar and salt live in the air. Somewhere above, ropes slap the mast with a steady patience. The ship's bell, distant, measures time in rings that don't ask for answers. You are at sea, and the sea is bigger than questions. Breathe in salt, breathe out whatever you carried here. We'll begin. Story 1. Salmagundi, the pirate's salad of Nassau. You step onto the main deck at dawn, Nassau Harbor breathing a slow mist across the low water. It is the early 18th century, and the island is a ragged frontier for men and women who broke with law, some by choice and others by circumstance. The ship rolls gently at anchor. Beyond, the beach is dotted with scrub and palms, and a few chickens that somehow belong to everyone and no one. What you are about to help make is not pretty, not plated, not courtly. But it is the dish that tells you how pirates actually stayed alive. Salmagundi. The name comes from a French word, salmagondis, meaning a jumble, a medley, a mixture that doesn't pretend to be neat. In English kitchens ashore, a century of cookbooks would describe chopped meats, anchovies, herbs, and pickles arranged in patterns for the table. At sea, the patterns eroded. Pirates took the idea and stripped away anything fussy. They turned it into a practical logic. Cook whatever is salvageable, chop whatever is old, dose it with acid, heat, and spice, and serve it fast to many. You start with a barrel of salt beef, the hoops creaking when pried open. The meat has been salted hard since some unknown slaughter months ago. A block of it fights back under the knife, white crystals lodged in every striation. You soak it in seawater to draw out the worst of the salt, then in precious fresh water to reclaim it from the sea again. Next comes fish, some dried cod recovered from a captured merchantman out of Madeira, perhaps, or scraps from yesterday's frying pan catch. If you are lucky, a hawksbill or green turtle is turned onto its back in the shade near the galley, still alive after weeks. A turtle stays edible because it stays living, a cruel arithmetic that makes it the most reliable meat in these waters. In Nassau, turtle meat joins the mix when there is plenty, nothing when there is not. On the makeshift chopping board, sometimes a spare hatch cover laid flat, you begin the reduction. Knives thock rhythmically, salt beef into dice, fish into flaked shreds, turtle into bite-sized pieces. Dull knives chew, sharp knives sing. Either way, the bowl fills because the bowl must fill. Around you, ingredients that mark out the Caribbean edge toward the work. Onions and scallions from a shore garden, sprigs of thyme and marjoram that survived the crossing in damp cloth, the hard emerald of a lime traded off a sloop, a handful of allspice berries shaken loose from a canvas sack, peppers that look small and harmless until you touch your eye. The peppers came by canoe, by market, by theft, by favor. No one asks too closely. There is no olive oil on most days, but there is fat. The scraped grease saved from the previous boil, the skim lifted from a pot of pork, a little slush from the coppers. Into a small kettle goes vinegar, sour, medicinal, and powerful. Vinegar is the quiet savior in a warm climate with suspect meat. It pickles, it scours, it erases some of the sea's stickiness. The cook, who may once have been an enslaved man forced across the Atlantic, or a sailor pressed and escaped, or a woman who found fewer questions asked in anchorages like this, crushes garlic and peppers with the bottom of a spoon until they surrender into a paste. He stirs it into the vinegar with a pinch of salt that you would think unnecessary, but isn't, because the other meats were soaked and are bland again. Salmagundi is a salad only in the sense that it is assembled, seasoned, and eaten before it goes bad. It is an algorithm for edible safety. Acid from limes and vinegar discourages rot. Heat from peppers masks hints of age and stimulates appetite dulled by long days. Alliums add a familiar bite that tells the mouth, this is food. Herbs remember a shore that is not always near. Sometimes chopped hard-boiled eggs, stolen olives, or pickled capers appear when a prize ship falls into the right hands. Sometimes there are only two things, salt, meat, and onion. Tonight there is more, and everyone notices. You carry the bowl, actually the top half of a sawn barrel, back to the deck. Men and women gather with tin plates. They are quieter than you expect. Eating is an engineering problem as much as it is pleasure. how to get enough to keep hands strong, eyes clear, and wounds healing. The mix is spooned out in damp piles. Peppers wake the tongue. The vinegar does its work. You taste smoke from yesterday's fire where the beef was briefly heated to loosen it. A stray hint of turtle fat lingers, rich and marine. Someone asks for a squeeze of lime and passes the half-fruit like a relic. The shore is close enough to smell resin from cut wood. In those woods, the word buccaneer was born from Baucan. The Taino and Carib raised wooden frames for slow-smoking meat. Some of the older hands learned that method from indigenous people on Hispaniola and Tortuga and carried it with them, one of the many quiet transmissions that kept bodies going. Salmagundi grew in that same exchange. European scraps, African spice knowledge, indigenous herbs, Caribbean fruits, turned by necessity into a democratically shared bowl. It is not a national dish. It is a survival dish, and that made it pirate. You watch how the crew eats. They use knives as shovels, spoons as trowels, fingers as tools. Bread is rare because flour turns weevilled and water turns green. When there is biscuit, it is broken and softened in the juices, and if it brings weevils, nobody says much. Protein is protein when storms are regular and wages are irregular. Between mouthfuls, the talk turns to the next prize. A Spanish Garda Costa rumored along the Bahama Channel, or an English sugar ship grandfathered into neutrality until someone decides it is not. Food sets the pace of plans. With decent food, talk grows longer, braver, more detailed. With bad food, talk shortens to grunts and quarrels. You look down into the emptying bowl and see what is left. Chopped stems, pepper seeds, a glossy smear of vinegar and fat, an anchovy or two glistening like coins in low light if some were found in a captured cask. There is an order to the disorder. Everyone eats first. The cook keeps the last spoonful to taste his own work. He is not thanked loudly, but he is noticed. He holds power because he controls what goes into bodies, and that more than speeches holds a ship together. Salmagundi, made this way in anchorages like Nassau, did more than fill bellies. It made a routine in a life that tried very hard to have none. It let a ship claim afternoon as a unit, a pause between sail repairs and prize caught rumors. It sat at the crossroads of stolen goods and grown herbs and boiled leftovers. It told a plain truth about pirate democracy. Shares of profit and shares of lunch were both supposed to be counted. Later, long after the bowl is washed with sand and water, you will wonder at the ingredients you can't see. Where did the vinegar come from? How was it kept good? And what did it mean to have enough limes and peppers in a place that could starve you by simply refusing to rain? Was the taste of this jumble merely fuel, or was it a promise that the sea could be made to yield something resembling home if only you could keep finding the right barrels? Morning slides into Nassau's light like a lid closing softly on a chest. You stand near the galley, little more than a brick hearth and an iron kettle cradled in a timber frame, and watch the cook wedge fuel into the coals. The smoke smells of mangrove and resin. The word for this hearth will shift over decades, galley, caboose, but the work is old. Scrape, stir, strain. Salmagundi is not a recipe here so much as a weather report of supplies, and to understand its taste, you trace the pathways that brought each mouthful to the barrel bowl. Provisions arrive three ways. First, through prizes, merchantmen taken at sea, their holds inventoried, their casks broached. Spanish ships carry olive oil, olives, capers, raisins. English vessels ship salt beef and biscuit. Dutch sloops appear with onions braided in ropes and jars of pickled things with labels you cannot read. Second, through markets that pretend not to exist. Small craft sliding between island and anchorage with plantains, peppers, limes, and fresh eggs, exchanging food for coin or cloth or rumors about patrols. Third, through what can be grown or gathered. The garden patches scratched into sand behind the ramshackle huts, the fish trapped in basket weirs set in the shallows, the sea turtles puzzled into the shade and turned on their backs to keep alive. Every pirate ship has its rules, written into articles, and while the clauses change from crew to crew, many say much about food. Equal shares of plunder are famous, but equal shares of provisions are the infrastructure of that fairness. Powder and shot are kept in common, so is bread, beef, and whatever sauce can be made. The quartermaster, elected by the crew, oversees the dole, and the cook answers to him more than to any captain. There is a practical philosophy in this chain. No one can eat more than their due without everyone noticing. The democracy of the bowl is the quiet foundation of the democracy of the deck. You begin to notice echoes of this food elsewhere. On French men of war, salmagundis reappears as display. On Portuguese brigs, yesterday's fish sleeps in garlic and vinegar as escabeche. Enslaved cooks move pepper sauces across decks and languages. In New England, spruce beer tries to patch scurvy with resin and resolve. The logic repeats: acid as shield, fat as carrier, herb as memory, chop as equalizer, bowl as contract. Think of the body this feeds. The sea charges interest on every motion, rope burns, salt scours, small wounds negotiate with time. A good salmagundi repays a little of that debt. It quiets a tremor in the hands. It clears the eyes for the grey shade where reef becomes depth. It is not the sound of a broadside. It is the sound of competence assembling itself, grain by grain. Ships live longer on competence than on courage. Dusk again. The oil jar stands lower, the vinegar deeper in its shoulder, the peppers almost gone. The cook teaches thrift: scrape the barrel top for the brown glaze and save it for tomorrow, a condensed ledger of meals. Most cooking is remembering, he says, and most remembering is deciding what not to forget. He lifts the herb bundle higher and banks the coals until they breathe instead of burn. You carry your plate to the rail and watch the tide turn out. A harbor exhales. You think of how many bowls like this one, across years and hulls, fed choices that never made a record. Reef now, spare that prisoner, steer a hair north and let the current add its quiet help. Pepper lingers after the bite is gone. Vinegar lingers after the meat is finished. The aftertaste is a kind of counsel. You swallow and feel steadier than the sky suggests for this small meal. Someday, far from heat and tar, someone will compose a salmagundi and call it heritage. Anchovies placed like punctuation, eggs quartered with ceremony, oil drizzled in parentheses. They will eat it under ceilings and talk about pirates as if appetite were a costume. You may wish them the lesson of the barrel bowl, that a dish can be a vote, that flavor can be fairness, that survival, when chopped and shared, becomes almost peace. And you may wonder, as the hull lifts and settles, whether the best taste was ever oil at all, or whether it was the lime's brief insistence that the perishable can be coaxed to last just long enough to keep hands steady through one more watch, one more crossing, one more carefully measured day. Story 2, Weevils in the Biscuit, eating the ship itself. It's cold in the bread room, which is only to say it is less hot than everywhere else. You crouch among casks and canvas sacks where the ship, bread, hard, square biscuits baked to the color of rope, sleeps like bricks. The air tastes of dust and salt. You strike a flint for a sliver of light and sea motes drift like plankton in a wooden sea. This is where the ship's future sits, in flour turned to stone so it can outlast weather, worms, and the long forgetfulness between ports. It will not quite succeed. You pry open a cask. The hoops groan. Inside are biscuit squares stamped by a victualling yard long gone from sight, Portsmouth or dipped forward if Navy, Bridgetown or Boston if merchant, anywhere at all if prize. They're made of flour, water, maybe a whisper of salt, baked hard, then baked again to drive out moisture. The dryness is their defense. The dryness is also their flaw. Dry bread breaks teeth, and when the cask sweat or the flour was already inhabited, the biscuits harbor guests sailors call by one name no matter what their species is: weevils. You learn the ritual. Each morning, biscuits are aired. You tap them sharply along the rail to loosen the gentleman within. White meal spills. Tiny bodies, larvae, beetles, things with too many legs for appetite, thud out and wriggle feebly. Gulls patrol for what you will not eat. Some days there are few. Some days the rail looks like a slow river of specks. The bosun tells you to do it briskly and without emotion, as if the rhythm matters more than the result. It does. The rhythm keeps disgust from becoming hunger's enemy. On deck, men break their ration, usually a pound a day, though the measure slides with fortune. Biscuit is rarely eaten naked. You soften it in whatever the day offers: a little brackish water warmed in a kettle, brine from salt pork, a mug of small beer in a navy ship, rum and water, a rough bombo in looser companies, broth scraped from yesterday's pot. Names accrete to these rescues: skilligalee when it is just biscuit and water simmered to a grey stew, lobscouse when bits of meat and onion make it nearly optimistic, danderfunk when crumbs meet fat and molasses and become something like a pudding sailors convince themselves is cheerful. You watch how people hold their bowls a little away from their faces, when the spoon rises, so they don't see more than they must. The weevils are not a single creature. You hear the old hands list them like weather. The biscuit beetle that drills tidy holes and smells faintly of curry when crushed. The flower weevil whose larvae travel like living commas. The moth that leaves webbing as fine as the smoke from a candle. They arrive in flower long before the ship does, eggs ground into grain from mills whose stones also shed a fine grit that makes sailors' teeth feel sanded. Or they enter later, through seams and lids, marching by the thousand from sack to cask to sack, finding in the hard loaves a city of air and starch. There are remedies, some theatrical, some effective. You can toast a biscuit over the galley fire until the surface browns and anything alive within chooses to leave. You can bake again, a third time, though fuel is dear. You can soak and skim, trusting buoyancy to select victims. You can pretend it is pepper. Many crews prefer to eat in dim light. What you cannot see, you do not have to classify. In the worst stretches, a man will choose the lesser of two weevils, a joke that is older than it sounds, and he will mean it. Biscuit shapes the day far beyond taste. It is compact, counts easily, and stacks without argument. Quartermasters and pursers love it for those reasons. It turns stomachs into ledgers. When a ship is chased or a gale forces storage to be shifted, the bread room and its casks become part of the ballast plan. Biscuit keeps the keel honest. In that sense, you really are eating the ship itself. Its weight, its balance, its mathematics, taking into your mouth the very geometry that keeps you from capsizing. It is a strange intimacy to chew on stability. You break a biscuit and watch it fracture along old stress lines like dried clay. In the crevices live biographies, the mill whose stones chipped this grit, the bakery gang who stamped the crown or anchor, the coals that browned the surface, the clerk's hand that marked the tally, the hoist that swung the cask aboard, the tropical noon that coaxed the first beetle to hatch, the moment the cooper's hoop shrank and let in a smell of bilge, the day the bread room flooded to your ankle in a squall and every cask swelled like a pregnant boast. You eat the sum of these decisions and accidents, their flavor a chord of flour, salt, wood, and time. Survival strategies settle into the crew without speeches. The cook keeps a shallow pan of water at a bare tremble and drops broken biscuit into it just before serving, so it softens but doesn't drown. Someone remembers from Barbados that a dash of pepper vinegar wakes old bread the way a whistle wakes a dog. The paste from yesterday's bowl of salmagundi stretches into today's skilly-galley. An able seaman dries biscuit on a line near the galley, so afternoon's damp doesn't take back what morning drove out. These gestures are small, but they reclaim an edible present from a dubious past. Sometimes you get new bread from shore ovens. It is soft for a day, then begins its migration to the ship's standard. Fresh biscuit can be dangerous to teeth too in a different way. It tempts you to bite like you would on land to trust. After storms, when casks have tumbled, you find shattered biscuit turned to dust. The dust becomes porridge. In desperation, that porridge is mixed with anything that thickens it: pea flour, pork fat, slush skimmed from boiling meat. People speak of the pudding called duff, flour and fat boiled in a cloth. When molasses appears from a prize, you see faces loosen for a minute, as if sweetness were a brief shore leave. You wonder about sickness. The old hands talk about gums that bleed and teeth that loosen, scurvy, the quiet subtraction of strength, made worse when biscuit is the only certainty. They say vinegar helps a little, citrus helps a lot when you have it, and fresh greens from shore help more than both, but the bread remains the backbone of the ration. Without it, meat is only meat. With it, meat becomes a meal. That arithmetic keeps biscuit indispensable no matter how much life it contains. The bread room teaches you a kind of patience. You learn to count casks and calculate days. You learn that a damp sack rots from the bottom up, so you turn it before it turns you. You learn to listen for beetle song, a faint ticking in the quiet watches, as if someone were writing a tiny letter inside a loaf. You learn that disgust is a poor navigator and that hunger is a disciplined one. You learn to keep a crumb for later because later will ask. At dusk, you sit with a mug and a bowl that smells faintly of onion and smoke. A breeze carries the smell of tar from the caulker's work and a sweet drift of mangrove from shore. The biscuit breaks where you touch it, yielding to soak and spoon. You look down and decide not to look closely. The choice feels ordinary, like reefing a sail before the wind asks, like checking a lash before the sea tests it. it is another seam you manage. In the dark, someone tells you that the best biscuit he ever ate was in a storm, when the cask split and the lot went soft, and everyone laughed because for once their jaws could rest. You think about softness and hardness and what you can afford. You wonder how a food so empty of story on land became, at sea, the quiet biography of survival. And you ask yourself, almost without words, whether tomorrow you will keep tapping the rail to shake the life out, or if the day will come when you simply stop looking and let the ship's small citizens share your ration, as if they had been promised a place there all along. By late morning, the deck is a geometry of biscuit laid out like tiles, each square turned face to the sun. The duty is called airing the bread, and it happens whenever weather allows. You flip the pieces with a practiced motion and hear the brittle click they make against the planks. It is not cooking, it is management. Moisture is the enemy you cannot see, the vanguard of molds and small jaws. The sun, the wind, and your patience are the cheapest preservatives you own. You start to understand where these bricks began. Not here, on this warm deck, but in shore yards where ovens the size of small rooms burn steadily. Flour arrives in carts, already alive with possibility. Millstones grind grain and shed grit, a fine mineral that will travel with you and sand your molars. In the bakehouses, men mix flour and water into a dough that knows only utility. The loaves are rolled thin, docked with holes, stamped with marks that say crown or anchor or nothing at all, and baked hard. Then, when you think they are finished, they are baked again, twice baked, thrice dried, heat doing the work of time so time cannot undo it later. The result is a food that refuses to rot, but also refuses to yield. From those yards to the wharf and into casks, the chain matters. A cooper's skill determines whether damp sneaks in at the stave, whether a hoop loosens at sea and invites a colony. A purser's honesty determines whether the pound you are issued is the pound recorded, or the notorious purser's pound that comes up light. Ashore, weight is law; afloat, weight is interpretation. Pirates learned early to dislike middlemen because they learned to taste them: short rations, inferior bread, casks that were not quite sound. It is one of the reasons a stolen biscuit, when it is good, feels like justice. You handle biscuits the way carpenters handle wood, tapping for hollows, listening for health. Some swear that a sound biscuit rings and a wormed one thuds, but on a tired day everything thuds. Remedies against infestation are a traveling folklore. You toast over the galley fire to drive residents out. You crumble and soak, trusting that life will float and starch will sink. You set the bread room open on dry days, lids off, to let heat scare damp back into corners. A few ships try fumigating with sour smoke or lighting small sulfur spills on a shovel, dramatic, choking, and not always kind to lungs or food. What works best is the simple math of dryness and vigilance. There are other mouths to consider. Rats find bread as if they were born knowing its location, which many are. Cats join a ship's company for this reason and earn their keep without signing articles. You learn to fix rat guards, tin cones around mooring lines that turn a whiskered climb into a slide, and to keep the bread room boarded, not just curtained. Rats will gnaw through canvas like monks through psalms. Their teeth are another ledger you balance. Rations draw the boundary of your day. A common measure is a pound of biscuit, issued with salt beef or pork on meat days, with peas on others. Meat days and fish days make a calendar that ignores weather and appetite. In looser companies, shares replace rations. Whatever the common stock holds is divided with a fairness enforced by proximity and knives. Biscuit is handy for both systems. It is countable, stackable, divisible. It turns hunger from a feeling into a unit you can plan around. When the quartermaster opens the bread room, the smell is like warm dust and promises kept just adequately. Not every sea leans on wheat. In the Caribbean, you meet flat rounds of cassava bread, cassava grated, squeezed hard to shed its bitterness, then dried into discs that last and last. Indigenous makers teach this economy, colonial plantations industrialize it, hungry ships adopt it when wheat is scarce or dear. Cassava bread resists weevils better than biscuit does, but it also resists the affection of those raised on ovens. Still, you learn that a round of cassava, cracked and warmed, steadies a stomach as surely as any stamped square. You hear the names other sailors use for the same solution. Ship's biscuit becomes hardtack in some mouths, tack in others, galleta on Spanish tongues, sheep's beschuit where Dutch rigs crowd the roadstead. Each word carries its own jokes, its own complaints, but the practice is identical. Dry it, store it, trust it, hate it quietly, and be grateful anyway. The sea has a way of erasing differences down to a common crust. The body pays in a currency you can feel. Chewing is labor, jaws ache. Old injuries argue with hard food. A man with a cracked tooth learns to soak his portion longer, to save crumbs for the end when fatigue is generous. The cook, who is half surgeon by necessity, warns you that a sore gum unnoticed today becomes a fever tomorrow. He tells you to rinse with a vinegar splash when you can spare it, not because vinegar is magic, but because it bullies the mouth clean. He says fresh greens would help more than sermons, and you nod because you have seen limes change men in a week, from grey to a kind of pink that means walking feels like walking again. Economy seeps into the pot. Skilly biscuit softened in water and warmed just enough appears when fuel is scarce or when the ship drifts in a windless week and everyone is sparing of everything. Add a spoon of fat and it becomes something comfort pretends to recognize. Lobscouse grows when onion is available and a scrap of meat dyes the water with memory. Dandefunk happens on cheerful days. Crumbs, a fist of molasses from a kind cask, maybe a scrape of slush, stirred until it pretends to be cake. These are small frauds against monotony, and no one complains about frauds that heal. You learn to respect the bread room as a system. Casks are chalked with dates and numbers. The older ones are issued first, chipboard first in, first out, an inventory practice born of necessity. When a squall opens a seam and the bread room floods ankle deep, the crew hauls casks to the deck, pries them, and spreads their contents everywhere, turning the ship into a hot, dusty bakery without ovens. You work in silence then, because every minute is a race between sun and mildew. Later, the whole vessel smells like toast and victory. The mind makes accommodations the way knots make sense under strain. People eat by feel more than by sight. They compare ratios, how much soak to how much crumb, how long to wait before the biscuit gives up its stiffness. They keep a private list of which casks seem kinder, which baker's stamp hides more grit or more life. They measure the day not by bells alone, but by the distance between one brittle square and the next. And beyond these practicalities, there is the question of enough. Storms will come. A chase will burn days you did not mean to spend. A promised port will turn inhospitable, or a governor will decide that your money smells like trouble. Then your careful chalk marks become warnings. 3 casks left, 2 casks that you already don't quite trust, 1 cask that has begun to whisper when the ship sleeps. You know what must happen. More airing, more soaking, more pretending, more porridge from dust. But you also feel the fragile edge where planning ends and appetite begins to ask for things the ship cannot promise. So you stack the aired squares back into their casks and drive the bungs home. You sweep the deck of crumbs for the bucket that feeds the next skilly. You wipe your hands on a coil, tasting flour in the air. And you wonder, not dramatically but plainly, whether the ledgers of hunger you keep, pounds and days and weather and will balance cleanly if the wind turns contrary and the horizon keeps postponing its answer. You wake to the particular quiet that follows a hard blow. The ship survived the night, the rigging hums with rainwater, the bread room did not. A seam opened and the lowest casks took the sea like buckets. Now the deck is an improvised bakehouse again, biscuits everywhere, spread thin as shingles, the sun asked to be a cook. You turn them and steam lifts in small ghosts. If you move briskly enough, mold will not have time to claim the week. The quartermaster announces short allowance with the even voice of a man reading weather. The ration drops from 1 pound to 3/4 while the wet casks are triaged. In navies are sure they pay short allowance money when stores fail. At sea, outside empires, there is only arithmetic and agreement. Shares tighten. No one argues much. Hunger is easier to bear when measured by rule than by quarrel. You lean on old techniques. Toasting drives out life. A biscuit raked back and forth over a low coal throws off a scent almost like coffee and crackles as beetles seek cooler ground. Crumb and soak follow. What floats you skim, what sinks you keep. If there is pea flour, you give the pot body. If there is only water, you accept thinness as a kind of prudence. The cook shows you a better fraud against monotony. Chowder, in its oldest meaning, salt fish or scraps simmered with broken biscuit until the hard edges give up and the pot smells like patience. Add onion if the islands favored you, add a spoon of slush if the day did. Suddenly, the biscuit seems to have decided to be food. The bread room itself has customs that feel like law. No open flame goes inside. On larger ships, a shielded lamp glows through a glazed scuttle, so flour dust meets light, not fire. Casks are chalked with dates and turned so the oldest faces you when the hatch opens. A canvas sling steadies the man inside while the ship rolls. He passes biscuit up through the scuttle where it is weighed and issued. Pirates adopt as many of these practices as their small hulls and quicker tempers allow. The point is the same, to keep the edible calendar from tearing. Rats reroute your plans. They know where the bread sleeps. You string rat guards on the warps when anchored and listen at night for gnawing, a dry sawtooth sound. Cats hunt because cats enjoy hunting. Terriers learn because you reward them. You set traps and find them sprung by something cleverer than you were in the dark. Losses are counted without drama, but counted still. Every biscuit that becomes rat is a biscuit that will not become tomorrow. On calmer days, you watch other seas solve the same problem differently. In canoes that travel outside the reef, flat cassava discs ride dry and indifferent to weevils. A Carib woman grates, rings, spreads, and toasts, repeating an old discipline until the bread is crisp as bark and lasts like a plank. Your jaw prefers wheat because memory is persuasive. Your stomach respects cassava because chemistry is not sentimental. On Dutch decks, ship's biscuit is crisp and slightly sweet from the bake. On Spanish ones, Galata comes out in roundels and lives in tins that pretend to be proof against air. The language changes, the ledger does not. Mutiny stories, when they are told later in taverns, dwell on pay and cruelty, but provisions are always somewhere near the fuse. Biscuit that rings when tapped is tolerable. Biscuit that collapses into damp web and beetle meal is an insult that gnaws twice. In disciplined navies, men grumble in chorus. In looser companies, knives vote. You see why quartermasters guard the bread room key like a reliquary, and why cooks, who can make a thin day feel thick, are treated with a courtesy close to fear. Your body learns the compromises. Teeth strike pause and ask the tongue for help. You soak longer, and the day's schedule drifts to meet the bowl's readiness. Vinegar rinses keep the gumline honest. Citrus, if luck runs to limes, reverses the quiet arithmetic of scurvy with a speed that feels like grace. When a prize yields molasses, dandefunk returns, crumbs fried in fat and sweetened into something that tastes like a story you can tell yourself while swallowing. When a turtle lies on its back, alive for days, its fat lends even skilligalee a roundness that makes the messroom sound a degree kinder. Sometimes, almost tenderly, you notice the lives carried in the bread. A baker's stamp from Diptford or Amsterdam, a cooper's careless joint, a purser's scratch that reads XIAI casks sound. You imagine the oven heat, the men turning loaves with paddles, the clerk dipping his quill, and the cart rumbling to a quay where the world smells of tar and oranges. That chain, grain to mill to oven to cask to hold to bread room to bowl, is an empire more reliable than flags. It built voyages across distances that used to be impossible. It also built histories no one asked to live, ships carrying chains, holds carrying people, rations calculated for bodies counted as cargo. Biscuit was there too, an accomplice made of flour. You swallow and do not pretend the ledger is pure. In the quiet afternoon, you help patch a cask with a new hoop warmed and hammered until it bites the staves again. The sound is satisfying, a ring that says wood trusts wood. You repack the aired squares, layer on layer, paper between if the day was generous, and feel the weight return to the ship. Ballast climbs back to its station. The bread room breathes like a lung that has cleared. Evenings find you holding a chipped bowl under the last light, the same bowl you held on better days. The spoon is steady. The biscuit is the same object it always was, rough, grudging, loyal. You eat it because voyages are longer than memories of softness, because plans drift beyond the wind's interest, because the sea pays wages in uncertainty and asks for competence in return. Hard food teaches slow habits, airing, turning, soaking, skimming, sharing. Those habits travel ashore when men leave the water. You can see them in warehouses, in ration lines, in the way cities learn to store winters. If you were to map the age of sail without battles or borders, only by the taste of daily life, the lines would be drawn in biscuit crumbs. They would run from ovens to oceans, from weevil to gull, from chalked cask heads to the soft tap of a rail at dawn. They would show how endurance is not a hero's mood, but a system of small, repeated acts, almost boring, entirely necessary. And when you look at your own shelves later, years away from salt, you might find the modern descendants lined up without ceremony, crackers sealed against time, emergency rations, bars that promise energy more than pleasure. You might shake a packet and listen for a ring, the old test traveling intact. You might wonder how much of the world you know was only made possible because someone, unseen, kept turning squares in the sun and taught hunger to wait a little longer. Story 3. Living larders, sea turtles on deck. It's hot on the open deck, the kind of heat that turns tar shiny and makes rope smell like sun. You wake to a slow scraping noise, a carapace on planks. A shape like a wet shield lies inverted near the mainmast, flippers working in slow-motion circles that move nothing. It is a green turtle, Colonia midas, hauled aboard at dawn from a net hung over the side. The quartermaster chalked the catch in a neat column, Turtle 1, and then kept moving. On this ship, turtles are not a delicacy. They are storage with a heartbeat. You learn the routine quickly. Twice a watch someone brings a bucket and sluices the animal to keep it from baking. A scrap of canvas is rigged for shade. Water is dear, so the splash is brief, measured against the gain. A living larder holds itself for days or weeks without feed, its slow engine idling. It will taste fresh when beef would only taste like brine and iron. The cost is water, space, and the quiet work of keeping a heavy creature alive without letting it escape. No one boasts about this duty. They just do it and then go coil line. The word turtle on these decks carries a geography inside it. Far to the west are the Cayman Islands, once called Las Tortugas, for beaches that used to move at night, shell on shell. For a century and more, turtlers launched from Port Royal and tiny keys, set up low hurdles of stake and brush in the shallows called crawls, and kept turtles pennied in seawater until ships came by to buy meat that was still walking. On Hispaniola's north shore, on the little island named Tortuga, buccaneers learned smoke from indigenous frames and added turtle to their stores whenever the season permitted. The animals made a triangle of food, capture at the grounds, storage in the crawls, consumption at sea, simple enough to persist beyond the flags that claimed it. The kinds matter. Green turtles are the prize for the pot. Their flesh mild, their fat tinted a translucent green that cooks call calapash, their lower gelatinous cartilage the callipee that sets into soup with a satin wobble sailors describe with a surprising gentleness. Hawksbills carry plates of tortoiseshell valuable ashore for comms and inlay. Pirates see in them trade as much as supper. Loggerheads are tougher and less loved, though a hungry crew grows philosophical about texture. Eggs, if you find them on a night beach, a place where sand remembers flippers like sketched commas, are a bonus issued quickly before heat erases them. You help with a hauling one afternoon when the lookout spots a dark hump drifting like a log that breathes. The boat goes down, the men slide quiet, and a hand catches the rim of the carapace while another hand takes the foreflipper like a wrist. There is technique to it. Turn the turtle fast and flat so it cannot swim, tip it into the boat without bruising your shins, lash it with a soft loop so the rope does not cut. Back at the ship, a tackle on the main yard lifts and swings the weight gently inboard. The turtle arrives on deck like cargo and like guest, wordless and inconvenient. Keeping it alive is housekeeping more than hunting. The bucket splash, the shade, the decision about where to stash such a low, stubborn shape when the deck must clear for work. In weather, turtles get secured like guns, chocked so they don't become their own kind of cannon. In calms, someone idly strokes a shell with the back of a knife and watches salt dry in a lace pattern and then stops because the thing blinks. You feel the strangeness of eating an animal that looks back at you longer than you look at it. When the day comes to kill and butcher, the work moves from deck to galley with a quiet efficiency that feels older than this crew. The cook lays boards across a pair of trestles to make a low bench. The cut is decisive, the blood carried forward to the scuppers and followed by buckets of seawater until the stain is only a tint. The shell parts with work. The meat comes in sections, some for salting down in small barrels, some for tonight, some for tomorrow's breakfast when dawn is a rumor and strength is needed before wind and duty discover you. Calapash and callipee go to a separate pot with onions if any, pepper if luck, and a scoop of yesterday's fat for body. The smell that rises is not sure luxury, but something steadier, a promise that the next watches can be kept. There is a ledger running under all this activity. Turtle means a pause in the draw on salt meat. It means fewer men with sore gums for a week and fewer quarrels over who got the greenest piece of beef. It means the quartermaster's chalk marks can be rubbed out more slowly, one less cask of pork opened now, and a better chance of reaching the next island on schedule. Food is navigation by other means. A living larder gives you miles. You listen to older hands measure change in beaches rather than in years. They talk about grounds that once were certain, where a man with a lantern could lift eggs by the hatful and footprints stitch the sand like script. They talk about quieter nights now, and boats that have to nose farther along the shore to find the soft scrape of flippers. Some blame Frenchmen, some blame Jamaicans, some blame time. No one says aloud that ships like this one, over and over, move the ledger toward emptiness just by surviving. Cruelty sits close to practicality. You note how quickly the bucket becomes habit, how easy it is to mark turtle, one, and see only the arithmetic that follows. Yet in the bowl you taste something like the sea-turned kind, the fat slick on the surface that carries pepper, the meat that flakes with a spoon and not a knife, the way men sit quieter over it, as if flesh that swam yesterday asks for a slower swallow. Food has manners, and this one asks for attention without speeches. There are superstitions too. Some sailors don't like turning a creature belly up for days and prefer to keep it in a net over the side, water moving over lungs and mind. Some say a turtle aboard ensures a calm, others that it calls storms, which tells you storms come no matter what you keep on deck. In the dark, you catch a shadow moving and remember the quiet eyes and feel, for a second, that the ship is carrying a tide in a single shell. Ashore in far-off cities, turtle will become fashion, whole shells paraded into London halls, soups celebrated in print, mock turtle devised when the animal grows dear, and diners still want the prestige of the idea. But out here your interest is not ceremony. It is calories that do not argue, protein that bears its own freshness, fat that tells tired muscles they were heard. You carry a bowl to the shade and eat slowly, thinking not of banquets, but of tomorrow's watch and how light feels when the body is fed. When the pot is ladled down to a glossy scrape, the cook pours a little water, stirs, and saves the brown for sauce, a concentrated memory of the animal's labor turned into your endurance. Someone coils a rope beside the empty trestles, and someone else wipes the deck until wood looks like wood again. The chalk ledger waits, the bucket waits. Somewhere on a beach, in a circle of darker sand, eggs wait until night and temperature decide them. You rinse your hands and look toward the low line of land where crawls once held hundreds, and where lanterns used to find the path between sleeping and hunger. You can't help asking, in a voice you don't speak aloud, how many more mornings the sea will offer up a shape like a shield for men with buckets and chalk, and whether a ship that relies on living larders is always, quietly, eating the future it needs. By mid-morning the sea lies slack as a polished plate, and work turns to errands that feel like maintenance for the future. You help coil a warp, then carry a bucket forward to where today's green turtle lies under its small tent of shade. The ship breathes around you, sailcloth ticking, bilge murmuring, a gentle thud as someone tests a cask hoop, and you realize how naturally a living larder has joined this orchestra. You splash the shell and watch water sheet off in glints like tiny knives. Somewhere aft, the cook is trimming onion with motions that keep time better than the bell. Turtle has a supply chain with more steps than the butcher's bench suggests. You hear it in half-told stories, men launching from the Cayman Islands in low craft for weeks at a time, mosquito hunters along the Mosquito Coast reading wind and tied the way other people read print, small corrals, the crawls, staked into lagoon shallows where captured turtles wait in seawater for buyers. A sloop from Port Royal might come skimming with rum in her hold and leave deep in the waterline with meat that still blinks. An English privateer, papers tidy and conscience adjustable, might pause to purchase a dozen, chalk the transaction neat, then sail off to look for a Spanish ship whose captain will also, unwillingly, become a supplier. The animals themselves draw a map. Cayman grounds used to be a certainty, old hands say, when a beach could seem to move as shells dragged themselves above the rack line to lay eggs. Bermuda shores gave their share. So did the Keys off Cuba's north coast, and bars and banks from Yucatan to the Bay of Honduras. Turtlers speak of weathering them down, meaning long, slow pursuit with a following sea until a breath breaks the surface where your hand can reach. They speak of turning them cleanly, flat to the boat, because a rolling turtle can shatter a man's ankle. Knowledge like this is not written, it travels by elbow and example. On your ship, the quartermaster keeps 2 books, one for plunder shares and one for provisions. Turtle lives in the second, a line that temporarily pauses the erosion of salt pork and beef. A week with 2 turtles on deck means a week of fewer quarrels at the cask. It reminds gums what fresh feels like. It oils the day's machinery. It also costs. Water for splashing is measured against men's thirst. Deck space given to a shell is deck space you cannot use for lumber or repair. Sleep is lighter when something alive scrapes at night. Every meal is a bargain with a list of footnotes. The cook teaches you the quiet arithmetic of parts. Calapash, the green fat that rims the shell, melts and carries pepper like a messenger that never stumbles. Callipee, the pale gelatinous tissue from the lower shell, becomes a soft architecture in soup, a set jelly that sailors describe more by feel than by flavor. Meat from the shoulders and thighs shreds under a spoon. The heart, if it still flutters when lifted, is set aside by some as luck, by others as waste. The ship decides once and keeps deciding the same way for peace. Offal becomes bait or becomes tomorrow's broth, depending on weather and appetite. Nothing is quite thrown away because distance disapproves of that word. You slow your breath when old hands talk about markets. In Nassau's easy years, you might trade turtle for vinegar, onions, a jar of capers from a Spanish hold, or a botager of oil that turns the week almost civilized. In Port Royal, before the earth buckled and swallowed streets in 1692, the turtler's season set a rhythm for taverns. Fresh meat for sailors, fresh coin for rumsellers, fresh rumor for everyone. Later in Kingston and Bridgetown, whole turtles crossed wharves on shoulders and disappeared into kitchens that learned to coax fashion from survival food. Far away in London, aldermen would one day make speeches over tureens. The Lord Mayor's feast a ceremony with turtle soup at its center. When real turtle grew rare or dear, mock turtle, calf's head and veal replaced the animal but kept the prestige. You try to imagine the distance from this wet board and bucket to a table with candles and gold spoons, and find it both short and long. You notice how technology changes the menu without changing its logic. Baucan, the raised wooden platform for smoking meat, keeps turtle edible longer just as it keeps hog or steer. Barrels turn perishable days into transportable weeks. Salt is a fuel you burn invisibly to preserve tomorrow. Vinegar is an insurance policy that tastes like medicine until you learn to call it sauce. All these tricks existed before you stepped aboard. All of them wait their turn now, depending on wind and luck. There are rules that are not written in the articles, but weigh as much. Some crews will not keep a turtle inverted for more than a handful of days. Others lash them in slings under the chains to let seawater move and gills imagine home. Some keep them over the side in a net when the sea is kind, hoisting them inboard at dusk to cheat sharks and thieves. On a hard work day, you barely notice you're tending a creature. On a quiet day, you see an eye that moves, and remember this ledger counts in lives. A few seamen cross themselves, not out of piety, but habit. Others mutter that a turtle calling at night means wind tomorrow, which is a way of saying weather arrives no matter what you keep. Decline threads the stories with a softness that feels like tide. Grounds that once filled boats now need longer searching. Beaches where eggs could be lifted by the hatful, as one man says, go quiet. You hear opinions, French, Spanish, English overfishing, hurricanes, too many small vessels with too much time between wars, and you suspect the answer is simpler, hunger at scale. Ships learn the convenience of a larder that walks, and the walking larder learn to vanish. Even pirates, who think of themselves as outside systems, draw lines on this ledger with every meal. Late afternoon brings a breeze, and with it a small debate. The water casks run lower than comfort. The cook wants 2 buckets for the evening splash to keep tonight's meat sweet. The carpenter wants the same 2 for mixing putty, because a hood end's seam weeps when the ship works. The quartermaster listens and gives 1. Out here, taste is always a coalition of appetite, repair, miles left, and shore distance measured in weather more than in numbers. You dip the bucket once, slowly, and pour as if the stream itself were a promise. When the pot comes up, the soup carries onion and pepper on a soft green back. Men sit against the bulwarks and let the spoon do the talking. Someone tells a Cayman story about a crawl so full the water looked tiled. Someone else says that was before his father's father. A boy who has said little asks if turtles sleep, and no one answers quickly, as if the question has too many kinds of truth. The cook says quietly that everything sleeps when it is allowed. You rinse your bowl, set it to drain, and look at the chalk on the quarterdeck rail. Turtle, 1, flanking a column of numbers that are meat days, fish days, biscuit days, lime days, rumor days. You feel grateful and implicated at once. The animal will carry you a few more watches, maybe a calm, maybe a chase. It will steady hands, iron out voices, make tomorrow less sharp in the mouth. It will also leave a space behind that you and others will hurry to fill again and again, until a beach stops moving at night. And you wonder, not with drama, but with the patience this food has taught you, whether the line between prudence and depletion is a rope anyone on this deck can see while the pot still smells good. Whether a ship that has learned to buy time by keeping a heart beating on planks can learn, just as carefully, when to stop buying. Evening work begins with the same unhurried certainty as tying a reef knot. Boards across trestles, knives honed on a wetted stone, buckets staged by the scuppers. The green turtle you have splashed and shaded all week lies quiet under the awning. There is no crowd. At sea, butchery is maintenance, spectacle wastes light. The cook's hands move like someone copying a familiar sentence. One sure cut, a pause that is respect or simply accuracy, then the careful, patient separation of shell and meat. Blood threads toward the drains and meets seawater before it can decide to be smell. The parts name themselves into usefulness. Dark shoulder meat for tonight's pot, paler belly strips for salting, the ring of green fat, calapash, eased free in soft slabs, the pale jelly of callipee lifted whole with a flat spoon to small kettle because it will set and hold. Offal becomes bait for tomorrow or broth for the morning watch, depending on weather and appetite. The heart, still fluttering, is a brief argument everyone resolves in the way the ship decided months ago. Nothing is drama. Everything is economy. You watch the salt crew pack what will travel, layers of meat, a sprinkling of salt, a shake of brine, paper if the day was generous, more meat, more salt. The cooper tightens a hoop with a few clean hammer taps that sound like correctness. In the galley, onion, pepper, a stray clove, and a memory of allspice bruised with the back of a spoon meet the calapash in a low simmer that makes the evening smell like competence. Vinegar waits its turn. Acid is the steward that never misses a watch. Bowls go out along the bulwark. Men and women sit with backs to rope and wood and let the heat in the spoon find its way inward. The soup is gentle, almost shy, a soft glide where salt meat is usually a shove. People speak in normal voices. Someone says this tastes like strength that doesn't need to prove it. Someone else remembers a Nassau cook who thickened turtle with a spoon of cassava flour and called it patience in a pot. You believe both. The taste carries you farther than the ship will sail tonight. In your mind, you walk through rooms you have not seen. London halls in bright candlelight where whole shells arrive like trophies and officials praise order while sipping engineered luxury. Taverns where the chalkboard lists turtle soup as if it were certainty instead of luck. Later, kitchens where mock turtle imitates the texture with calf's head and veal, the flavor with herbs and wine, and the prestige with the name. Fashion keeps the ceremony even after the creature grows scarce. Prestige hates to admit it feeds on absence. Back on deck, your world is smaller and more honest. Turtle here is neither showpiece nor metaphor. It is relief from the arithmetic of casks, a reprieve for gums, a softer morning when the wind asks for hands on wet canvas. You feel how many choices food carries quietly, whether men argue or listen, whether a watch is kept by will or by ease, whether the next chase is judged possible or too dear in sweat. A living larder buys time, which at sea is the most precious currency. And yet you cannot not hear the second ledger, beaches that fall silent, crawls that hold fewer shells, grounds that demand longer hunts. Old hands measure decline without numbers. It used to be a lantern and a hatful. Now it is a long walk and a thin night. Islanders grumble that ships take too much. Ships grumble that the world has turned stingy. The more honest admit that hunger, scaled up by hulls and habit, taught the turtle to be absent. Even those who never plan tomorrow can read this. The cook cools a tray of callipee until it trembles and holds. He lifts a piece and says, almost to himself, that London would call this clarity and charge silver for the word. He slides it back with a wooden spoon. Tomorrow he will dice it, return it to the pot, and give the broth a body that makes spoons move steadily even when the sea is not. He is not a philosopher, but he keeps a kind of ethics. Use what you take with attention, stretch it across days, share evenly. Articles can say equal shares, the ladle makes it true. Night furls down, the last light collects on the curve of the empty upper shell, a glossy dome that fits no other purpose aboard. Someone will scrub it, because scrubbing is what you do when you don't know the future. The quartermaster rubs a damp sleeve across his chalk, turtle, once, twice, and leaves the ghost of the word because a ledger always remembers. The breeze smells faintly of mangrove and pitch. Far off, a bar breaks white where the sea rehearses borders. You think about cruelty and clarity. You have turned a creature over. You have kept it alive because it was more useful alive. You have killed it when the calendar and the casks asked. You have eaten with gratitude and with an awareness that gratitude does not undo the taking. The sea has taught you worse indifferences. This one at least feeds quietly and teaches you to measure. You do not bless it or excuse it. You name it, record it, and carry it in the wrists you will need at 2 in the morning when the squall arrives, as if conjured by the old superstition. Later, after years and shores, men will tell this story as treasure, not the coin kind, but the law kind. How turtles were once so many that sleep on certain beaches was a hazard. How a lamp could paint the sand with moving shadows. How a ship could stay at sea because the deck was also pantry. The next part of the story is thinner and more honest. How the easy grounds emptied. How fashion swallowed what hunger began. How mock turtle tried to make nostalgia edible. Laws will appear in places that have the energy for rules. Habits will lag on waters where hunger still does the scheduling. Somewhere, a child will read the word calabash in an old cookbook and not know the weight of water buckets or the sound a shell makes against planks at dawn. You rinse your bowl with a dipper of brackish water and set it upside down to dry. The deck shows the day only in faint stains, soon sanded by feet and salt. The helmsman eases the wheel a spoke, and the ship answers like a horse that trusts a steady hand. You feel fed in a way that has nothing to do with abundance and everything to do with the calm that comes when a system of small acts sustains itself for another watch. Before sleep, you stand a moment by the rail and let your eyes find the low, dark line that might be shore or cloud. You think of the beaches you have not seen in years, their quiet, their old busyness, and you ask yourself a question the sea will not answer. If the habit of keeping life on deck taught you to survive, can it also teach you, in time, how to stop before the shore forgets how to move? Story 4: Sour Fruit and Spruce, Makeshift Weapons Against Scurvy. The first sign is not dramatic. You notice it while biting a biscuit that has already asked much of your teeth, a little ache at the gumline where salt and flour meet. Then bruises appear from knocks you don't remember, and old wounds sulk instead of closing. Men become tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The ship keeps her course, bodies begin to lose theirs. Someone names it without ceremony, scurvy, and the word is as plain as a knot, as old as hunger at sea. You inventory the pantry with new eyes. Salt beef and pork, admirable in their obedience to time, have nothing left of what the body now demands. Peas thicken the pot, but do not mend gums. Vinegar wakes the tongue and bullies knives clean, but it improves morale more than blood. What helps, everyone says, is something fresh, and fresh is a difficult category in a moving wooden town. You are told the old stories while turning the morning's biscuit over a thin simmer. Jack Cartier's winter at Stadacona in 1536, when his men rotted until local people taught them to boil the boughs of a tree they called aneda, likely white cedar, and the men recovered as if a lock had found its key. Later, North Coast sailors boiled spruce tips and called it tea. Colonists made spruce beer with molasses and yeasty froth and swore they felt their legs remember how to belong to them. These are not luxuries, they are corrections. Today's ship is poorer than a city and richer than despair. You make a list with the quartermaster's chalk that is really a navigation plan. Islands ahead that might give limes or oranges, a river mouth rumored to hide watercress, a cove where settlers sometimes trade onions, a fort where the storekeeper, if he drinks rum in the afternoon, forgets to count lemons after dark. Fruits have their own winds and currents, the citrus from Madeira bound for English tables, the West India limes carried in small sloops, the barrels of Rob, concentrated juice that spoil themselves if boiled too long or kept in bad metal. You learn to taste not only for sour, but for life. Sour is a flavor, life is the thing it carries. The cook is practical. He has kept a coil of recipes for days like this. Spruce beer when you are far north or on a timbered coast. Young black spruce tips boiled in a clean kettle with molasses, cooled and pitched with a little yeast if you have it, then casked where it can bubble itself into a health you can drink. It tastes like a forest decided to remember you. If there is no yeast, the dregs from yesterday's brew will do. If there is no molasses, a thin infusion still gives a little. The men drink it with faces that pretend it is only for thirst. On river days, shore parties cut watercress and sorrel, wild greens with a sharpness like good advice. They come aboard wilting and are eaten quickly, and you can almost hear gums unclench. You measure symptoms the way the pilot measures shoals. Purple blotches on the shins that don't explain themselves, teeth that loosen in their beds. A sailor who was cheerful last week now fumbles rope as if it were unfamiliar. You remind yourself that scurvy has its own weather. It worsens with monotony, abates with variety, hides from those who keep even a small stream of living plant in their days. The cook stashes a line of jars along the shadiest beam, onions if a prize yields them, pickled cabbage when fortune is northern and German, a hoard of tamarinds from a Spanish hold, and most precious, a small keg of lemon juice guarded with a seriousness usually reserved for powder. You hear the name James Lind from a bookish surgeon who keeps his instruments sharp and his voice gentle. He talks about an experiment on the Salisbury in 1747, 2 men fed citrus who recovered while others, given vinegar or elixir of vitriol or cider or seawater, did not. The surgeon admits he has seen men improve on lemon and fall away when the lemons run out, and the preserved juice is wrong, boiled to death in copper, perhaps, the way a decent cure can be ruined by a careless pot. He says the Admiralty will one day write a rule about daily citrus. The quarterdeck snorts softly because rules usually arrive long after ships have learned them the hard way. You brew spruce beer because you can, and because the smell makes the deck feel briefly like land. Molasses darkens the copper, and you mind the heat so it does not scorch. You watch the first yeast breath fleck the surface and think absurdly of crowds in a market. The brew will be ready in a day or two. Meanwhile, a small boat rows to a low shore to ask for greens with coin and politeness. Men come back with 2 baskets and proud faces, and everybody pretends not to be counting leaves. The greens hit the pot with onions and a piece of pork to make the medicine less like medicine. People eat in a hurry that is not greedy, something closer to gratitude that tries not to look like fear. You discover that sour is a graduate teacher. Vinegar makes ships bearable and cuts meat fatigue, but does not change the body's arithmetic. Citrus does, lemons most strongly, oranges kindly, limes usefully if they are the right limes and not tired West India ones that have forgotten their strength after boiling and storage. Sauerkraut, when you can pry it from a German cask or impress it from a Dutch one, behaves like a promise that keeps. It has patience where lettuce would wilt and sulk. The cook acquires a barrel, threatens anyone who wastes it, and keeps a plate of it moving through the mess with a persistence that feels like leadership. There is a politics of freshness. Captains hoard citrus for the sickest or for the officers, depending on temperament and fear. Quartermasters argue for equal measures because equal measures are how a ship remains a ship. You watch what fairness looks like in a bowl: 3 onion slices to a man, a spoonful of kraut each, a gill of lemon water for anyone who says his gums bleed. It is rationing as a kind of prayer. When the beer is ready, the cook issues it with an explanation no one needs. It helps. They drink it anyway, because even a myth that tastes like trees is kinder than a truth that eats your legs. After a week of these attentions, the deck looks different. Men straighten when they stand. The purple fades. The surgeon says quietly to keep going, because scurvy sulks and returns if you let it. He shows you a drawer of teeth he has pulled on other voyages and closes it again without theatricality. You feel the ship become slightly more itself, as if planks tighten when men feel possible. And yet the uncertainty remains. The lemon keg is small. The shore with cress is behind you now, and the next one may be a rumor that the chart misheard. Spruce cannot be boiled from an empty horizon. Preserved juices fail if they were killed by heat or bad metal before you ever saw them. You stir the brew and taste it, and it tastes like hope that knows it is perishable. So you keep a ledge of remedies like a pilot's list of headlands. Cedar or spruce when timbered coasts allow. sauerkraut when a northern prize is kind, onions whenever markets smile, lemons and oranges whenever the gods of convoy and purse align, limes with caution and gratitude, cress and sorrel when a shore gives softly for an hour. You keep the habit even when spirits lift, because habit is what carries the ship between accidents of luck. One evening, as the sun drains itself to copper and the first watch snugs a reef, you sip the forest bitter beer and look at the small lemon keg like it is a talisman. The surgeon runs a finger along his ledger, frowns, and then nods as if a column balanced. You feel better, but you remember how quickly better at sea can turn back into before. And you ask yourself, quietly, how a ship that must move through months of salted sameness can keep a small stream of living sour from drying up just when the horizon decides to grow larger again. The ship learns a new rhythm when scurvy is named aloud. Bells still divide the watches, but another clock begins to tick. How many days since the last fresh anything? You feel it in small errands. A boy crosses the deck carrying a jar of sauerkraut the cook guards like powder. The surgeon rinses his instruments in vinegar, then, with a private thrift, tips the rinse into a pot where onions will meet it. A keg, tarred at the seams and chalked in a tight hand, lem, sits in the shade like a promise you ration by the gill. You find yourself drafted into brewing. Spruce tips are bruised with a wooden mallet until they breathe a smell like wet needles and new wind. Molasses goes in, thick as the sea in calm, and water follows, careful to keep the ratio that turns bitterness into medicine. The copper sings when it warms. You stand close enough to watch, but not so close that steam writes its lesson on your face. The first froth is skimmed. When the kettle cools, the cook stirs in a scoop of yesterday's yeast, as if reminding the liquid how to be alive. Casks are scrubbed, rinsed, and filled. Later, when the bungs thump under small pressure, a line of men grins in the quiet way sailors grin when patience moves. These cups do not cure by poetry, they cure by chemistry you can only half name. Still, experience has memorized what books argue. Long before your deck, Sir James Lancaster sailed east in 1601, dosing one of his ships with lemon juice and watching crews on the undoosed ships falter and bruise while his men mended. A century later, John Woodall, the East India Company's surgeon, printed the advice, lemons as remedy, in a book that spent more time on actual voyages than on shelves. On the Salisbury in 1747, James Lynn tried to turn observation into proof, dividing scorbutic sailors into pairs and giving each pair a different potion. The two who swallowed oranges and lemons improved so quickly that the fruit ran out before the experiment did. Your surgeon tells these stories in a voice that never rises, because history rarely persuades the purser, but the sick persuade everyone. You watch where sour comes from, because sources are also seasons. Madeira lemons ride out in convoy like cargo too important to trust to chance. West Indian limes pass from small sloops to larger holds, useful, cheaper, sometimes weaker in the way that matters most. Oranges are kind but scarce in the right months. Tamarind pulps well and keeps its temper in barrels if someone lined the staves properly. Sauerkraut, German to its core, travels better than lettuce and argues less with heat. Watercress withers while you row it back to the ship. Eat it the hour it's cut, or you might as well have chewed rope. You learn to nurse a lemon keg as if it were a clock, an ounce to a man, sweetened if sugar shows itself, mixed with water when the day runs long. You mark who drinks and who spits and who pretends not to need it. The deck slowly brightens. A man whose legs were mapped with purple sees the stains pale to old bruises. Gums that bled at a touch begin to sulk less. The surgeon makes no speeches, he writes. You glimpse the ledger, names down the left, small notes in a column headed by a symbol you recognize as his shorthand for citrus issued. A second column records greens, another kraut, another spruce beer. It looks like navigation with a human coastline. Points, bearings, the caution, keep this point open of that. The quartermaster, who thinks in shares more than symptoms, studies the same page as if it were weather. Then comes the confusion that only procurement could invent. Sour is not always the same sour. You hear talk, first as rumor, then as warning, that certain limes, boiled hard for storage and kept in metal that answers badly to acid, lose the strength that matters. Later, some will call the seamen of your nation limeys and mean health by the slur. Later still, Explorers who trust processed lime juice too far into frozen months will learn that a sour can be a ghost of itself if it was scalded to death before it reached their deck. The lesson travels slowly. Lemons work best. Limes can help when handled kindly. Heat and copper can murder cures quietly. By the time an office ashore writes it into a rule, 1,000 common cooks have already corrected the recipe by memory and scold. You think of Captain Cook, heard in port talk like a rumor of competence. He enforced cleanliness, aired bedding, traded for greens compulsively, brewed spruce beer when coasts offered trees, and made sauerkraut a habit rather than a treat. His men grumbled and ate it anyway, and their gums learned gratitude faster than their tongues. You see in the habit lines of your own ship small echoes of that stubbornness. The kraut jar passed even on better days, the lemon water measured even when men feel strong, the brew made again before the last cask is empty. Practicalities keep the philosophy honest. The cooper tins the inside of a small lemon keg, not with the dangerous shine of cheap metal, but with a lining that won't quarrel with acid. He seats the head with a smear of tallow and a strip of canvas, hammers until the hoop speaks the true note, and chalks the date because time is part of flavor. The cook keeps citrus out of the sun and away from the stove's backside. He won't let a ladle that just stirred salt beef go near the lemon keg. You think these are fussy rules until a careless day turns a good barrel tired in a week. Shore becomes a new kind of map, not harbors, but gardens. On one island, a woman sells you 4 onions, 2 bunches of chives, and a story about a hurricane that pulled the sea into the street. On another, a man with hands like rope knots trades a basket of sorrel for iron nails because a roof waits for weather. You bring back small harvests the way other ships bring back news. For a few meals, the pot tastes like letters from land. You learn, too, that vinegar is the faithful cousin, present, helpful, never quite the same as what you wish for. It keeps knives honest and meat hopeful. It makes old bread behave. It pleasingly confuses the tongue into believing in sharpness. But when a man is already fadding, old scars reddening, breath short on the second reef, vinegar is sympathy, not remedy. You still use it, because sympathy has its own chemistry aboard a small world. On a bright noon when the wind holds, you help issue the day's ounce of lemon juice. Men line up without hurry. The deck smells briefly like a market alley, pith, peel, a whisper of flowers that never grew on water. A few men toss it back, others sip it carefully as if a gill of sour were a fragile loan. The boy at the end of the line asks you, in a voice he pretends is bored, whether the keg will last to the next island. You say long enough, because that is what a ship mostly says to itself. By evening the spruce beer is ready. It pours with a soft hiss, bready and green at once. People drink and say little. The surgeon smiles at no one and checks gums the way a sailmaker checks a seam. The cook slides a plate of kraut along the bench as if sharing an opinion. Somewhere aft, a man who could barely climb from the orlop last week hauls on a brace and grunts, which is his way of calling the day good. The keg, the jars, the casks, their levels write tomorrow's by subtraction. You come to understand that cure at sea is never a thing, only a stream. The stream dries unless tended. It floods if luck smiles, it trickles most days, and you learn to drink from a trickle. The ship becomes a school of patient habits, airing bedding, rinsing with sour, trading for greens, brewing what trees allow. None of it is heroic. All of it is how voyagers cross lonelier latitudes, without leaving men behind in their own bodies. Night takes the heat down to a bearable hum. The last cups of beer are issued, the keg is bunged, the kraut jar tied in canvas and slung back in its cool corner. You lie with your back to the planking and feel, under the familiar creak and slap, a quieter arithmetic, ounces to days, leaves to watches, health to miles. And you ask, as sleep folds over you like a sail coming down neat on a yard, whether the crew's new habits will harden into custom fast enough to outpace the distances ahead, or whether the sea, as always, will test your discipline the moment the keg's chalk mark slides below comfort. The change, when it finally holds, does not arrive as a trumpet. It arrives as a habit that refuses to lapse. Morning after morning, the lemon keg comes out of the shade, the gill measure is rinsed, and the quartermaster's thumb blackens with chalk as he marks the day's issue. Gums stop bleeding in the quiet way a leak stops, first less, then not at all. Men climb like themselves again. You begin to notice work rather than illness. Canvas thundering on a yard without leaving anybody gasping, the long pull on a brace accompanied by complaint instead of silence. The ship's noises retake their authority. Ashore, a storekeeper, coaxed by silver and pride, sells you 2 small kegs of juice that were not boiled to death and not married to copper. The cooper tins them carefully, not with the bright treachery of bad metal, but with a dull, safe lining. He seats the heads with a strip of canvas and tallow so the hoops sing true. The surgeon watches with a satisfaction he hides behind a ledger. He adds a new column, daily issue, and writes today's date as if it were a headland you can steer by. You hear the older sequence in scraps of talk at the rail. Lancaster in 1601 pushing lemons on one ship and watching it outpace its consorts not by speed but by survival. Woodall printing his advice in the early 1600s for anyone who could read and would bother. Lind on the Salisbury parceling remedies like a cautious cook, his 2 citrus patients improving so fast he ran out of fruit before he ran out of proof. All of it old news at sea and somehow still news to officers ashore. The difference now is not knowledge but discipline. The sour has been promoted from remedy to routine. The cook, who mistrusts theory and loves results, recites his catechism to anyone who drifts too near the caboose. Keep the keg cool, keep the ladle clean, do not let the beef spoon touch the lemon. Issue small and steady, do not hoard for a crisis and create one by waiting. Brew spruce when trees allow, not because it replaces citrus, but because it keeps the day honest. Trade for onions even when men feel well, because feeling well is exactly when people forget what made them so. He says it without triumph, the way you say, mind your grip, at a line. The ship's diet grows ordinary again, which is to say survivable. Salt meat less insulting when followed by a mouthful of actual life. Biscuit more forgiving when softened in a broth that has argued with green things. Sauerkraut keeps proving itself the perfect sailor, sour, patient, indifferent to heat or delay. The lemon keg tapers visibly but not fearfully. You notice that talk in the mess returns to prizes, soundings, and rumors of governors rather than gums and bruises. Health, it turns out, is talk you don't have to have. A line of cause begins to etch itself beneath the waterline of your thoughts. With daily citrus, voyages stretch. With longer voyages, charts thicken into atlases. With fewer men dying badly in the dull center of the ocean, ships can afford to be purposeful rather than merely lucky. Empires, which are only logistics with flags, learn to depend on a taste. You swallow an ounce that puckers your cheeks and think, not grandly but correctly, that this small sour is a keel under keels. Of course, the rule will wander before it roots. Somewhere in a tidy room ashore, an order will one day standardize the naval ration, lemon juice issued daily, later replaced in misjudged thrift by certain limes that traveled worse and cured less. Far off in colder histories, expeditions will carry processed sour that turned weak in the kettle and weaker in the tin, and they will learn the old lesson again, that a flavor is not a cure unless its life survives the making. You will be gone by then, but the caution sits easily in your hands now whenever you rinse the measure and smell the faint flour hidden in the rind. Spruce beer continues to do its sturdy civilian work. It is not a savior, it is a citizen. It puts a green edge on the day, helps men drink what they would have drunk anyway, and catches those who would otherwise drift toward the gray. You drink it and taste shore even when no shore exists. The boy who asked whether the keg would last now asks what mock turtle is, having heard the cook grumble the phrase. You explain, quietly amused, that somewhere rich men will one day miss a thing they helped spend and will teach veal to pretend to be turtle the way vinegar pretends to be lemon. He laughs and sips his sour and looks brighter than the jest. Even the rituals adjust. Bedding is aired because the surgeon's scowl proved as effective as law. The bread room is opened on dry days because the quartermaster discovered that men obey rules that give them softer food. Limes, real ones, good ones, not tired ghosts, appear in a sloop's locker and are traded for a handful of nails and a rumor about a convoy. The rumor is true, which means you will sail under company for a week, and your keg will not need to do any miracles. You call that grace and do not bother to identify its theology. One afternoon, a man whose gums had been the color of storms sits with you and peels an orange so slowly the ship seems to match his pace. He eats it by threads. He says nothing and then says everything at once. Feels like the boat got lighter. You nod, because there is no better description. The hull rides the same. The world rides differently inside it. The surgeon closes his ledger one evening with a thump that sounds like satisfaction edited for C. He has drawn a simple line beneath the column of citrus issues and written, "Continue." It is the dullest instruction and the most important one a ship can own. You tie the keg slings a little higher, deepen the shade, and check the tap for leaks like a helmsman checking his compass. Night settles with the calm of work well divided. The last ounce is measured. The bung goes home. The breeze brings a clean resinous whiff from the spruce casks where beer winks like weak tea. You lie back and feel the ship's heartbeat soften to its old familiar. The creak that means wood and weather are on speaking terms again. Somewhere forward, someone whistles a tune that travels poorly on land and perfectly at sea. You close your eyes and taste a small echo of bitterness and bloom, the afterimage of a lemon. You think how odd it is that a civilization's reach could be lengthened by a flavor, that an empire's shadow could be sharpened by a habit of rinsing a measure and keeping a keg out of the sun. You wonder quietly, so the question doesn't wake the deck, how many of our modern distances still depend on some small daily sour we barely notice until it goes missing. Story 5. Grease and glue, slush, portable soup, and the economy of fat. You wake to the smell of steam and iron. The galley copper has been working since first light, a squared belly of hammered metal that turns meat and water into something the ship can swallow. A grey bloom rides the surface, fat rising like weather. The cook rakes it gently with a flat ladle. He does not hurry. This, he says without saying, is one of the ship's quiet treasuries, slush. Slush is the grease life leaves behind. Salt beef and pork give it up when their fibers finally loosen. Turtle adds it in greener notes. Even a little fish will contribute if the day has been generous. The cook skims and skims, tipping each opaque spoonful into a small cask staved tight and kept out of direct heat. Later he will strain it through canvas to take out the char and bone. For now, it cools to a pale, waxy lid that promises usefulness more than pleasure. You learn how fat travels aboard. A smear on a mast helps hoops run without biting. A whisper on a block's axle turns a squeal into a purr. A finger's worth along a line keeps hemp from fraying where it rubs a stubborn edge. In wet weather, a coat on boots turns water into beads. In dry weather, a dab on knife handle stops cracks from opening like mouths. Lamps drink it sullenly when oil is scarce. When fuel runs thin, a cake of slush feeds the fire with a steadiness wood does not offer in a squall. Nothing aboard dislikes fat except time. There is a commerce under all this housekeeping. When a ship reaches a port with honest shops and a chandler who minds his business, slush becomes money. Chandlers boil it again, scent it, and pour candles by the hundred. They render soap that smells like industry more than like flowers. In some companies and in many tailies, a portion of the sale returns to the crew and disappears into comforts, tobacco, knives, a shirt that pretends not to be second-hand. Men call that purse the slush fund, a phrase that lands soft on the tongue and hard on a purser's ears. Even where coin never appears, grease spent wisely shows up as fewer broken blocks and fewer quarrels with squeals. Not all slush is for gear. Some finds its way back into the pot, carefully fenced from rancid smells and smoke. A spoon of it turns biscuit and molasses into dandafunk that tastes like memory trying to behave. A scrape browns onions into something that promises dinner rather than punishment. The cook keeps 2 jars, one marked for mouth, one for everything else, and you learn quickly not to confuse them. The jar for mouth is guarded like a secret. The jar for everything else is loaned like a tool and expected to come home wiped, but not empty. Fat is architecture when you cook at sea. It carries flavor in a world that eats flavor for sport. It rounds hard salt beef into something your tongue does not mistake for rope. It lets pepper speak broad and onion speak low. More than that, it is calories that do not evaporate when wind takes your appetite and the day takes your patience. On cold nights, men eat and then go quiet the way a fire decides to hum instead of spit. You begin to think of strength as something that glistens faintly on the surface before it sinks and gets to work. There is another treasury in the galley that looks like a mistake until you are told its name, portable soup. The cook calls it glue. You find a shallow tray lined with parchment, slick with a brown sheet that has pulled itself from the edges and puckered into a landscape of cracks. It began as bones and odds boiled into surrender, knuckles, ribs, skins, sinews. hours under a lid until the liquid thickened, then hours more with the lid angled so steam could leave and leave and leave. Strained clear of grit, poured thin, dried where smoke can't bully it, it became a flexible, dark amber that smells like boiled patience. Cut into squares, wrapped from the air, it will keep better than good intentions. Portable soup is how a galley makes time edible. A square dropped into hot water with a scrape of slush, and a pinch of salt becomes broth when the day had no right to broth. Add onion or biscuit crumbs or a piece of yesterday's fish, and it pretends to be supper convincingly enough that men sit back afterward and sound like they remember their own names. Some captains buy crates of it ashore where clever cooks turn stock into trade. Some surgeons argue for it as medicine for those who cannot chew. Everyone agrees it weighs less than comfort and behaves better than hope. You help with a batch, bones go in by the bucket. The simmer begins before breakfast and seems willing to continue until judgment. Scum rises, you skim. The cook opens the lid with a stingy hand to let vapor out but not virtue. Toward evening, the liquid has become a slow animal, reluctant to move. It pours like thick glass. Strained through cloth, it loses its cloudiness but keeps its intention. On a shelf above the caboose, away from greedy hands and faster molds, sheets take shape. You lift one corner and feel it resist. The ship's pantry turned into a piece of leather you can fold and carry. Men call it glue because it looks like something that should stick planks rather than fill bellies. In truth, it can do both. A dab softens a stubborn knot, another stops a creaking seam until proper work can be done. Mostly, though, it becomes the afternoon that would otherwise taste like salt water. It is not luxury, it is agreement in a square. We will eat even when weather or chance says we should not. In thick fog, the smell of a pan of portable soup is a lamp you can taste. You see in the economy of fat and glue how a ship survives its own mathematics. Meat cannot be all meat. It must be also light, heat, lubrication, currency. Bones cannot be waste. They must be tomorrow saved against a day that will not wait. The cook is treasurer and engineer, making sure nothing leaves the system until it has served 2 masters, and if possible, 3. When you watch him scrape the last jelly from a cloth into the tray, you are watching a kind of quiet doctrine. That endurance is what happens when leftovers learn to have a second career. There are failures and lessons. Slush goes rancid if kept warm or sunstruck. Then it stinks with a personality and must be consigned to the lamps or the yardarms far from noses. Portable soup turns sour if dried too thick or stored damp. Then it blooms with a ghost fur you do not negotiate with. The cook swears softly, teaches again, and begins another batch, because error at sea is a luxury you correct by repeating work with more attention. Evenings show the doctrine at the table. A spoon of slush wakes onion, a square of glue dissolves into broth, biscuit softens like it remembered ashore. Someone says the word Sunday, though it is Thursday, because the bowl tastes arranged instead of merely endured. The lamp above you burns steadier on the same grease that glossed your soup. You feel, fork to lips, like a small engine that has been oiled at all its joints. In port you will smell chandlers rendering your week's skim into candles and soap, and think, briefly, of the line from copper to wick. At sea you will rub a block and hear the difference slush makes, pour a cup and taste the difference glue makes, and count the miles those differences bought. You begin to suspect that voyages are not lengthened by courage so much as by sheen and jelly, by a thin layer where wood slides, and a thin square where water thickens. The copper breathes, the tray dries. The little slush cask wears a halo of clean smears where careful hands have borrowed. You rinse the ladle and hang it high so flies cannot interview it. And you ask yourself, as the day settles into its familiar creaks, whether tomorrow's endurance will come more from the small cask of saved fat or from the stack of brown sheets cooling above the fire, or whether the ship only truly moves forward when both kinds of thrift are kept alive at once. By noon the galley copper sighs like a kettle that has opinions, and the small slush cask has grown a pale lid that jiggles when you thumb it. The cook knocks his ladle clean against the rim, 1 neat tap, never 2, because neatness is how you keep grease from turning on you. He sets the cask in the shade, out of the stove's breath and away from flies that treat fat like a charter. You begin to see that aboard a wooden city, grease is not a byproduct. It is currency, medicine, glue, and when the day goes right, flavor. Aft the bosun in the mouth that has no time for syllables keeps a private ledger more honest than most pursers. Blocks that squealed last week purr after a thumb of slush. Barrels slide on smooth hoops because the yard got the same attention. Rigging that once fretted at a stubborn sheave now minds its lane. You learn the small ritual, a rag, a smear, a patient turn, a test pull. Grease in the right place is the difference between a sail that answers a whisper and a sail that makes you raise your voice. Then there is the hull. In harbor light you help lower a boat with a cauldron lashed in its belly, a smoky stew of tallow, resin, and a sniff of sulfur heaving at a low boil. The men dip broad mops and pay the ship's bottom where they can reach, between tides, between barnacles. Before copper sheathing found its way to more hulls, this was a common hedge against fouling, a slick skin to make barnacles doubt themselves and teredo worms slide off to bother some other plank. The work smells of candles and apothecary. The sea turns opalescent where drips widen. The bosun nods once when the mop lifts cleanly from a fresh patch. Less drag means a quieter wake and a day made slightly longer by the same wind. Slush ashore becomes a different arithmetic. In towns that like ships, chandlers love crews who skim their coppers. Tallow boiled, clarified, and scented turns into candles that burn steadier than a man's memory. Soap rendered from the same fat and strong lye takes the smell of bilge and salt from shirts that have been honest for too long. In some companies, the value of slush returns to the mess as coin or credit. Men buy needles, knives, tobacco, and a shirt that pretends not to remember another body. You hear the phrase slush fund spoken soft, like a joke that pays. A purser who tries to net the proceeds for himself becomes unpopular with an efficiency that sails rarely see. Back aboard, fat slips back into the bowl with the shyness of a rescuer. A spoon of slush makes onion remember sweetness and coaxes pepper to speak in paragraphs. Peas, which are work more than comfort, gloss themselves into something that at least looks like a promise. Biscuit crumbs fried in a film of grease and dabbed with molasses become dandefunk that tastes like a holiday a man once had and cannot quite place. The cook guards the edible jar as if it were the lemon keg's smaller cousin. The other jar, the one for blocks, boots, and stubborn wood, he lends like a kind tool and expects to see again. Portable soup, the glue moves through the day with a quiet authority that makes other foods behave. When the watch turns wet and late and the fire sulks, a square dissolves into hot water with the patience of something that has already done its hard work. Add shaved onion, biscuit grit, and a scrape of slush, and you have a broth that persuades a body it was planned for. The cook wraps the sheets in parchment and hangs them in a draft that is not quite a wind. He checks for the first ghost bloom of mold the way a sailmaker checks for a prickle at a seam. If he sees it, he murmurs a word that is not for prayer and cuts the spot away before it votes. You learn the failure modes as if studying charts. Grease goes rancid when warm, sunstruck, or left with scraps that invite politics. Then it smells like a story you cannot stop hearing and belongs to lamps, not mouths. Glue turns sour when dried too thick or stored near steam. Then it wears a fur and pretends to be alive in the wrong way. The only answers are shade, thinness, air, and attention. The cook repeats the doctrine for anyone whose hands drift foolishly near the cask. Cool, clean, covered, small, slow, steady. He could be talking about seamanship. Light itself comes under grease's jurisdiction. Rushlights, rush piths dipped in tallow, offer a thin, loyal glow for the logbook and the surgeon's drawer. Lamp wicks trimmed with the sailor's love of edges drink slush when oil is dear. Oakum twisted with a dab of fat becomes a torch that laughs at spray and then scowls at it, and the scowl is light. Night watches that might have been darker by a degree become merely dark, which is a kindness no one names. The economy of fat touches places you don't expect. Boots dressed with grease repel a squall's first argument. A scraped rope mended with a slushy hand quiets because the fibers learn to lie down again. A stubborn knot yields to a thumbnail slicked with what yesterday floated over salt beef. If you count the miles grease buys through easier hauling, kinder sails, a tidier wake, you begin to suspect that tallow and slush built more voyages than speeches and flags combined. Food takes its dividend. Suet, when a prize yields it, turns flour into duff, the dumpling that makes men remember Sunday even when the almanac says Wednesday. A handful of raisins changes the same lump into plum duff, which is a negotiation between nostalgia and actual fruit. Peas porridge gets a spoon of slush and becomes less earnest. Salt fish fried in a pan slicked with yesterday's skim tastes like an argument you can win. These are not luxuries. They are reminders that endurance is easier when the mouth believes. There are other fats, and the ship sometimes steals their labor. Train oil from whales, rare on a pirate deck, common enough on a whaler, burns in lamps and paints spars. Tallow candles from the chandler's shelf come back aboard as steady winter daylight. Even turtle fat, green and quiet, learns to do gear's work when the bowl is kind and the cask is mean. You respect fat that changes jobs without complaint. Packages tell you what the ship cares about. The slush cask wears a tidy lid and a line scratched near the top. The cook's way of knowing if hands have thieved for non-galley uses. The glue sheets have a dedicated shelf far from the stove's caprice. The bosun keeps a small pot of clean slush in his ditty box beside twine, needles, a palm, and a whetstone, and he closes the lid like a man who has learned that tidiness buys more seconds than skill. The quartermaster sees the same hoards and thinks in weeks. How many soups when weather sulks? How many mops of tallow before barnacles write their names? Ashore slush sells, afloat slush serves. The tension appears when the horizon does. Do you part with fat for candles and soap, turning skim into coin and comfort ashore, or hoard it for blocks, boots, hull and supper? Voices are persuasive on both sides. The bosun wants quiet gear. The cook wants quiet bowls. The crew wants tobacco and shirts. The cooper wants hoops that slide into obedience. The quartermaster wants math to balance with fewer quarrels. You test your own appetite for thrift and find that it changes with the weather. Generous when canvas hangs fat in a fair wind. Tight-fisted when a squeal begins in a block. You cannot reach in a sea that will not sit still. In port you walk past the chandler's vats and feel a private pride. Those candles began as steam above your copper. In the same breath you feel private doubt. Will you miss that sheen when a yard refuses to lower in a squall and a block answers with complaint instead of music? The economy of fat is not a theory. It is the next hour, and the hour after, and the watch after that, and then the smell of a pan that promised more than it should have. Evening brings proof that thrift can taste like kindness. The cook drops a square of glue into a pan with water and a whisper of vinegar, stirs until the sheet forgets it was a sheet, then finishes with a spoon of slush. The broth goes glossy. Biscuit softens into it, as if relieved to be forgiven. Men sit back with the slow exhale that means a day has agreed not to argue anymore. Lamps burn on the same substance that glossed the soup. The ship seems to hum at one frequency. And still the ledger is not finished. A new squeal will rise from some corner tomorrow. A fresh breeze will show what the hull has gathered. The galley copper will lay another pale lid for the cask. A chandler somewhere will haggle for what you skim. A duff will bob in its cloth like a friendly boy. A watch will be kept not by courage, but by lubrication and broth. You rinse the ladle, hang it high, and ask yourself whether the mile you'll make tomorrow will come more from the slick under the ship or the gloss in the bowl, or whether the true purchase lies in the argument you have not yet resolved between selling fat for coin and keeping it for the ship that must spend it in 10 quiet ways you cannot predict. Portlight has a way of making even work look ceremonial. You help drag a little cask of galley grease down a creaking plank to the chandler's door, where vats breathe softly and the air smells like laundry, beeswax, and hot iron. The chandler's man heats your slush until it clears, skims the cloud, drips a little on his thumb to judge how quickly it sets, and names a price as if reciting a tide table. Coin changes hands, not much, enough to buy needles and a length of twine, maybe raisins for a future duff. Back aboard, someone jokes about the slush fund and winks, and you realize the phrase will leave the ship one day and march into offices with the same shrugging usefulness. Small money for small problems, born from fat that had a second job. Grease keeps doing that, changing careers. On a fair morning you sit in the boat, while men pay a smoky wash of tallow and resin along the reachable hull. The sea under you turns slick where drips kiss it, barnacles scowl and hold a little less tightly. The bosun says copper sheathing will make this half-day ritual obsolete soon enough, thin plates fixed to planks so worms doubt and weed gives up. In some navies, it already has. You look along the waterline and imagine a future hull that needs fewer mops and more nails, a ship that spends afternoon hauling rather than painting. But even copper won't quiet a block or sweeten a pan. Fat will still be asked to do a dozen unglamorous things between whistles. Portable soup finds its own afterlives ashore. A victualling agent with tidy cuffs purchases sheets by the crate. A kitchen a hemisphere away melts them into broth for men who never saw a mast. Later, kitchens will boil bones in factories and bottle the essence, stamp labels that promise vigor, press the reduction into neat cubes wrapped in foil. The idea is unchanged. Make the useful part of animal stubborn against time, then reverse the spell with hot water and a little faith. Your hands know the texture before the name is printed on any paper. In quiet water, you notice new habits growing next to old ones. Candles poured from your slush burn in the forecastle like tame moons. Rushlights dipped and redipped by a clerk another line in the log, or a surgeon another careful stitch. A square of glue slipped into a pocket rides to the foretop with a man who distrusts the weather. He shaves a corner into his tin when the watch turns long and cold. These are small advantages, but the sea is a place where small advantages behave like weather. There are disappointments too, because thrift has predators. You open a jar to find rancidity has walked in overnight smiling. The cook holds it at arm's length and banishes it to the lamps, where it burns penance into light. A sheet of glue turns furry because it dried where steam bullied it. The cook trims the bloom away with a paring knife and mutters that you dry thin or you feed ghosts. A block screams because someone borrowed the bosun's pot and forgot to wipe grit from the rag. You can smell the error from the waste. Fat forgives many things, it does not forgive carelessness. You keep learning how far the arithmetic travels. Grease on parrels means fewer men needed at the yard. Fewer men at the yard means a watch changes faster. A faster change steals a minute from the wind's advantage. Minutes, accumulated, turn into miles. Glue in the pot coaxes biscuit into something a mouth won't fight. A willing mouth returns strength to hands. Strong hands close a seam before rain decides to live there. The chain is invisible while you do it and obvious when you step back. Sheen under load, gloss in the bowl, a day purchased for the price of scraps. Shore changes around you too. In chandlers' shops, candles crowd shelves in ranked serenity. Soap is stacked like bricks and smells of lye and perfume arguing. A clerk wraps your purchase in paper that has not yet learned how to be common, and you walk back to the boat with a parcel that is, in a way, this morning's skim gone to finishing school. In the same street, you pass a cooper selling new hoops bright as vowels, and you think of how the world's trades braid themselves into a rope that feels smooth only because 1,000 roughnesses learned where to lie down. News travels with the rain. Someone reads from a gazette that a navy across the ocean plates more hulls with copper every season. Fouling loses a little of its tyranny, tallow loses a little of its job. A pamphlet says boiled meat essences now come in tins stamped with confidence. A man brags that mineral oil makes a block forget its squeal better than kitchen fat if you can get it. You listen, interested and not threatened. Ships will change, the twin needs will not. Something to make wood slide, something to make water into broth. You see consequences in places you didn't look before. A crew treated to portable soup and a careful spoon of slush-fed duff is less likely to quarrel when the wind dies at sunset, more likely to laugh at a rope's joke, more patient when a seam asks for attention in rain. Good grease quiets the ship's voice so conversation can occupy the air. Good broth lets sleep lean heavier, shorter. You begin to believe that voyages lengthen not by any single improvement, but by a committee of small, boring messes voting in your favor hour after hour. Late afternoon you help the bosun open his ditty box. Inside sits a palm, a handful of marlin, 2 needles, a whetstone, and a little pot of clean slush with a lid that screws down as if someone ashore thought about waves for a living. He dabs a thumb, runs it along a line that has begun to whistle, and the whistle stops like a child when the right adult speaks. That silence feels like competence finding its home again. Supper is a lesson in compound interest. The cook dissolves a square of glue into a kettle where onions have gone soft, finishes with a spoon of slush, ladles across biscuit like a kindly tide. A shred of salt beef becomes tender enough to be memory instead of duty. Men sit with their backs against timber that slides obediently because yards were greased at noon. Lamps burn on the same substance that glosses the soup. It is all one system, humming. Night brings the mild hiss of a steady wake. You lean at the rail and think about what will last and what will be museum. The tallowed hull will become copper, then iron, then things that do not need mops. The glue will become tins and cubes and powders, fat will be named, numbered, fractionated. But the logic will remain, because work is always friction and living is always dilution, and a ship like a city, like a century, moves best when someone keeps a little sheen where wood meets wood, and a little body where hot water meets hunger. The copper cools in the galley, the cask wears its pale lid like a thought, the glue sheets darken as they dry. You breathe the close smell of clean tallow and the distant smell of tideweed and tar, and ask a quiet question you already know has no single answer. In our long, clever march away from candles and coppers, what new kind of slush and what new kind of glue are we silently depending on now to keep our own days sliding and our own water thick enough to swallow?